When a CEO goes undercover to test his new driver selection, he can't even back a truck into the bay without crunching a mirror. The whole yard laughs, except for one quiet old-school driver who steps in to help. Why risk your reputation for a stranger? Stick around to find out. The yard was already humming before sunrise. Diesel engines roared awake one by one, their guttural growls echoing off warehouse walls. It smelled of rubber, sweat, and burnt coffee. Exactly the kind of place where reputations were made or broken before your shift even started. Among the cluster of rookie drivers nervously checking their clipboards stood a man in his early 50s, tall, lean, wearing a well-worn cap pulled low and a borrowed Carhartt jacket. On paper, his name was Paul Grant, a first-time applicant with zero verified trucking experience. In reality, he was Richard Reynolds, CEO of one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the country. He had no illusions about how hard this was going to be. Richard hadn't been behind the wheel of a semi in over 30 years. Not since his uncle's old yard in Iowa where he'd learned the basics during college breaks. But back then, no one had cared about digital logs, AI routing, or 12-step safety protocols. Now, everything was regulated to the second, and Richard wanted to see for himself just how much of that translated to actual safety and actual respect on the ground. "Grant," barked the instructor, clipboard in hand. "Truck 16. Skills test 1. Straight line reverse, no spotter." Richard gave a polite nod, tried to swallow the lump in his throat, and climbed into the cab. His first mistake was obvious, forgetting to disengage the parking brake. Laughter trickled from the other rookies. His second came 5 seconds later, grinding the gear into reverse with a jolt that shook the mirrors. And then came the real humiliation, zigzagging the trailer so badly that the orange cones behind him collapsed in a mess of plastic limbs and slushy snow. Someone whistled. "This guy ever seen a truck before?" Richard climbed down, trying to hide the heat in his face. He hadn't expected to pass, exactly, but he hadn't expected to look this incompetent either. The instructor made a note. "Retake tomorrow." Next, as Richard stood off to the side, pretending to study his form sheet, an older man with steel-gray hair and faded tattoos on his knuckles approached. "Let me guess," the man said, voice gravelly but not unkind. "First time in a 10-speed? "Something like that," Richard muttered. "Name's Joe. Don't let the punks get to you," he said, nodding toward the smirking younger drivers. Half of them got handed licenses from TikTok. Joe Reed didn't look like much. Flannel shirt under a faded vest, jeans patched at the knee. But he moved like someone who knew his way around 18 wheels and 50,000 pounds of steel. His handshake was firm but weathered, a man carved out of the job itself. "Here," Joe said, dragging a stick through the snow to sketch a crude overhead diagram of the docking zone. "You're coming in too sharp. Let the trailer do the thinking. Just guide it like a drunk friend trying to get home." Richard laughed. Genuinely. Felt good. Over the next hour, while others took their turns and tried to outdo each other, Joe stayed with him, gave him tips, encouraged him to sit in the cab and feel the turns, even when not under test conditions. He showed him how to feather the clutch instead of pumping it, how to listen to the trailer's rhythm through the seat vibrations. It was almost beautiful. Joe didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just coached. Patient, precise, without ego. "You from around here?" Joe eventually asked. "Not really. Spent most of my time behind a desk," Richard answered truthfully, if not fully. "Well," Joe said with a shrug, "maybe it's time to stretch your legs." Later that day, Richard sat on the edge of the bed in his modest company-provided motel room. His hands still smelled of grease. His body ached in places his Peloton workouts never reached. But what gnawed at him most wasn't his own failure. It was the way those younger drivers had sneered. The complete lack of empathy in the yard. The way management had stood back, arms crossed, silently amused. In his role as CEO, Richard had seen the glossy reports, the driver satisfaction scores, the PR campaigns about driver-first culture. But today, on the ground, that illusion had shattered. Joe had been the only one to notice the humanity behind the awkward stumbles. The only one to offer help, not judgment. And that, Richard realized, was worth more than any corporate strategy session. Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting the quiet yard in white. Tomorrow he'd have to retake the test. He knew now he wasn't just here to fix procedures or optimize logistics. He was here to fix culture. And Joe? Joe was the kind of man this entire company should be built around. But first, Paul Grant had to earn his stripes. The morning after his disastrous test retake, which he barely passed thanks to Joe's guidance, Paul Grant found himself staring at a clipboard with his first week of assignments. Mostly ride-alongs, dispatch said. Standard protocol for greenhorns. But there was a note scrawled in ballpoint across the bottom. Grant assigned to read, Unit 412. 7-day regional loop. Joe had requested him. By the time Paul approached Unit 412, Joe was already loading the back of the rig with supplies. Basic tools, a cooler full of sandwiches, and 2 giant thermoses of black coffee. You're early, Joe said without looking up. I figured you'd appreciate that. Joe grinned. Don't make it a habit. I like having the moral high ground. The cab smelled like old leather and menthol. Faded Polaroids of a younger Joe with a wife and 2 little boys were tucked into the sun visor. The colors washed out, but the emotions still sharp. A rosary dangled from the rearview mirror, swinging slightly as Joe fired up the engine. Buckle up, he said, shifting into gear. We've got 1,200 miles and 7 pallets of industrial HVAC parts to deliver. Let's see if you brake before the truck does. The first leg took them through endless stretches of gray highway, with rain spitting against the windshield like a ticking clock. Joe filled the silence with stories, most of them real, some clearly exaggerated. About a tire blowout in Amarillo that nearly sent him into a ditch. About the time he outran a snowstorm by 15 minutes and got paid double just for showing up alive. Company used to send fruit baskets to your wife when you hit a safety milestone, he muttered during one lull. Now you're lucky if they remember your name. Paul, hidden behind his rookie disguise, just nodded and listened. Between stops, he took mental notes. Actually, he recorded them on a hidden voice memo device sewn into the liner of his jacket. It wasn't paranoia. It was business. Trailer 3's brakes are misaligned. Delivery ETA window is 18 minutes. Physically impossible. Joe refused to forge time log. Manager hinted at skipping deadhead report. Over and over, little details emerged that painted a grim picture of how things actually ran when corporate wasn't watching. But beyond the data, something else began to form, a relationship. Joe taught him how to shift down on wet inclines without riding the brake. How to read crosswinds by the way flags rippled in truck stop lots. How to negotiate with a grumpy dock foreman using a 6-pack of Red Bull and a well-timed joke. In a rusty diner outside Tulsa, over meatloaf and burnt pie, Paul finally asked the question that had been brewing since day one. You ever think about quitting? Joe shrugged. Once, after Kandahar. Roadside IED put shrapnel in my leg. Took 6 months to walk without a limp. Thought I'd never drive again. He tapped his knee, where a faint metal clink echoed. Titanium rod. Airport security loves me. What made you come back? Joe looked out the window, where trucks lined up under flickering lights. Had a buddy once. Taught me how to rebuild a carburetor with nothing but a wrench and chewing gum. He told me, driving ain't just a job, it's freedom in reverse. Never forgot that. Paul smiled, then grew quiet. You think the company sees you that way? Joe took a long sip of his coffee. Used to. Now it's all spreadsheets. Bonuses for fuel efficiency. GPS watching your bathroom breaks. They say they want heart, but they measure heat maps. Later that night, parked in a cramped lot behind a rest stop, Paul noticed Joe rubbing his left shoulder, wincing. You good? Old injury, Joe said. Flare-ups. You see a doctor? Joe hesitated. Not since they moved us to that high-deductible plan. For $1,000 out of pocket just to get told I need more ibuprofen. Paul clenched his jaw. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was neglect. And it wasn't just Joe. Every time they stopped, they met drivers from other depots. One had been clocked for sleeping too long during a blizzard delay. Another was fined for late delivery even though his trailer had a cracked axle no one had replaced. Behind every load number was a human story, and Paul was beginning to understand just how far removed his boardroom truly was from the road. At the end of the week, back at the depot, Joe slapped Paul on the back. "You did good. You're still green as a Granny Smith, but you kept the rubber side down. That's something." Paul laughed, genuinely touched. Joe paused, more serious now. "They're talking about cutting some of us older guys loose. Optimization, they call it. But I've seen this before. They lay off experience to save short-term, then wonder why turnover spikes." Paul didn't know what to say. He'd come undercover to observe systems, policies, protocols. But what he'd found was something deeper, a culture teetering on the edge of losing its soul. Joe had become more than a guide, he was a mirror. And the reflection staring back was one Paul couldn't ignore. Something needed to change. And soon. 2 days after their return from the road, Paul stood in the depot's cracked parking lot, staring down a 53-foot trailer and a narrow, uneven dock. "Reverse dock test," said a clipboard-holding trainer with zero patience. "No spotter. No guidance. You've got 7 minutes." Paul's throat tightened. He'd practiced this maneuver only twice, and both had ended with cones flattened like soda cans. Now, under the glare of impatient yard supervisors and muttering drivers, his hands felt like blocks of wood. He climbed into the cab, gripped the wheel, and tried to breathe. 5 minutes later, the trailer was crooked. The rear bumper had lightly clipped the dock edge, and the right side cone lay crumpled beneath a tire. The trainer didn't say a word, just jotted a mark on the form and walked off. By lunch, the whispers had spread. "Dead man driving. Should have never passed phase 1. Another safety risk just trying to coast into a paycheck." Inside her corner office overlooking the dispatch floor, operations manager Kendra Slade was already typing up the termination form. "This isn't personal," she told the depot's HR tech. "But if we let one trainee slide, we undermine the entire process. The brand stands for precision. We can't afford visible failures." Joe Reed heard about it before the ink dried. And when he did, something snapped. The dispatch office was a glass cube of fluorescent lighting and cold calculations, doc assignments, digital logs, efficiency reports. Joe didn't knock. He pushed the door open hard enough to rattle the blinds. "You're cutting the kid?" he said flatly. Kendra looked up, composed but irritated. "He failed a basic competency test. He was never trained for it. I saw his schedule. No one walked him through reversing in the yard. You want accountability? Start with your own instructors." Kendra crossed her arms. "We don't have time to handhold every underperformer." "He's not an underperformer," Joe growled. "He's green, yeah, but teachable. This company used to train people. You remember that? Or were you too busy watching dashboards?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kendra stiffened. "This isn't your call, Joe. And frankly, this kind of outburst is why I had your name on the cut list last quarter." The room went dead silent. Joe didn't flinch. "Then do it. But don't pretend this is about safety. This is about optics. And numbers. And pushing rookies out the door because they haven't been blessed by a checklist written by someone who's never hauled steel in the rain." He turned and walked out before she could answer. By that afternoon, word of Joe's confrontation had spread across the yard. Younger drivers, many of whom saw Paul as a liability, began mocking the situation. Reed's pet project failed the test? Shocking. Guess old man Joe's mentoring program isn't OSHA certified. But others, especially older drivers and night shift loaders, rallied behind Joe. He's the only one who's trained anyone in months. They just want cheap drivers with no spine. They'll cut you the second your cost per mile creeps up. The tension hit its peak the next morning. Dispatch assignments were delayed as groups of drivers argued openly near the fueling stations. 2 left their rigs idling in protest. A late departure from Dock 6 caused a missed time window on a high-value contract. A freight client logged a formal complaint. That afternoon, a directive came from corporate HQ. Launch a full depot review. Kendra, furious, scanned the CCTV footage and driver logs, hunting for someone to blame. She noticed Paul had spent time near both rest areas where the arguing broke out. "I knew he was a plant," she muttered, half suspecting something deeper but lacking proof. "He's stirring the pot. Too much time near Joe. Not enough time learning protocol." She called Paul into her office. "You're a distraction," she said coldly. "We tried, but it's clear this job isn't the right fit." Paul looked at her, calm but conflicted. He could end it all right here. Reveal his identity. Watch her backpedal. He had recordings, documents, enough evidence to launch a full procedural audit. One phone call and Kendra's career would be in freefall. But that wasn't why he'd come. Joe had stood up for him not knowing who he was. And the depot's cracks weren't caused by any one villain. They were symptoms of a system that had lost its compass. If he fixed this with power, it would only prove Kendra right, that the rules didn't apply to the right people. So instead, Paul stood up and said quietly, "If I go, I go. But Joe Reed's right. This place trains numbers, not people. And sooner or later, the numbers stop showing up." Then he left the office. That evening, in the driver's lounge, Joe handed Paul a steaming mug of vending machine coffee. "Sorry, kid," he said. "I tried." Paul nodded. "I know. And you did more than try. You showed them what integrity looks like." Joe smiled faintly. "Yeah, well, don't let it get you fired." Paul looked at the older man, gray at the temples, walking stiffly from years of bad suspension seats, still trying to hold the line. He knew what came next. The mask had to come off. But not yet. There was still one more lesson left for everyone. Lightning split the sky over the depot yard as the urgent call came in. A time-sensitive load of medical equipment had been delayed 3 hours at a transfer station. The client was threatening to cancel the contract, a multimillion-dollar loss. There was only one option: assemble a team overnight and move the freight across state lines before sunrise. Everyone was called in, even Paul. "I need bodies, not excuses," Kendra barked as she briefed the night crew. "Storm warnings or not, we roll in 15. Reed, your lead truck. Paul rides with you." Joe just nodded, silent and stiff-backed. Paul caught his eye. He hadn't told him yet. About anything. The rain hit hard just past midnight, a sheet of cold needles hammering the cab windshield. Paul sat beside Joe, silently watching the man's worn hands move through gear shifts like muscle memory. No GPS, just a printed route and an internal compass forged over 40 years. The trailer behind them held nearly a ton of portable respirators. Lives literally depended on the delivery. Behind them, a convoy of 3 rigs followed close, each driven by a mix of skeptics and younger drivers who, days ago, had rolled their eyes at Paul's every move. Now, with contract penalties looming and weather closing in, they kept their mouths shut and followed Joe's lead. 2 hours into the run, disaster struck. One of the newer trucks in the convoy, assigned to a rookie who'd never driven in mountain rain, lost control on a tight turn. The trailer jackknifed, blocking part of the highway shoulder. The driver was unharmed but rattled, and the rig couldn't move on its own. Paul jumped out without hesitation, rain soaking him instantly. Joe followed. While the others radioed dispatch, Paul climbed beneath the disabled truck, flashlight clenched in his teeth, diagnosing a locked rear brake line. He barked instructions to the rookie, then used a spare connector to temporarily bypass the failure. Joe watched in stunned silence. "Where the hell did you learn that?" he asked. Paul didn't answer. By the time the convoy reached the delivery center, dawn was breaking over a soaked skyline. They'd made it with minutes to spare. Kendra was waiting. Her face was pale, unreadable. She gestured for Paul to follow her into the client's office, where a rep stood holding the signed delivery confirmation. "Do you know what this is?" she asked Paul quietly. "A contract saved." "No," she said, turning the tablet screen toward him. "It's a surveillance feed. From last night." The screen showed Paul crawling under the trailer, directing traffic, overriding a broken system. "And this," she added, switching tabs, "is a background check I ordered. Richard Reynolds, CO. Net worth 7 figures. You filed for the job under the name Paul Grant using an alias license number. That's not just unusual. It's potentially fraudulent. Paul stood still. I should fire you, report you. But I won't, she said slowly. Because I saw the footage. You fixed what our real team failed to. You risked liability. For us. I wasn't here to expose anyone, Paul replied. I came because we lost something. This company used to build drivers. We stopped investing in people, so I needed to see why. Kendra didn't speak for a long moment. So what happens now? Paul turned toward the window. Outside, Joe was still unloading straps from the trailer, soaked to the bone, but smiling. Now, Paul said, we rebuild it. 1 week later, a company-wide meeting was held in the depot yard. Drivers, managers, warehouse techs, all gathered to hear the news. When Richard Reynolds stepped onto the flatbed trailer turn stage, there was a gasp. Even Joe's jaw dropped. You lied, he said later privately. I had to, Richard replied, to see if the foundation was still solid. You proved it is. Joe stared at him, stunned. Why me? Because you were the only one who didn't ask who I was. You just showed me who you are. In the days that followed, sweeping changes were announced. A new mentorship program, a safety overhaul, revised training modules built from real driver feedback. And most importantly, Joe Reed was named Director of Driver Development with a salary, benefits, and full medical coverage. The younger drivers who once mocked Paul now shook his hand. Even Kendra, grudgingly, admitted the company had needed the shakeup. But the biggest change came from a simple sign installed above the driver lounge. People before performance. On his last day under the name Paul Grant, Richard packed his locker slowly. Joe stepped in, holding a small box. Inside was an old gear shift knob, worn down from years of use. On the side, someone had carved the initials JR, Joe's father's, passed down through generations of drivers. Joe handed it to him. You're one of us now, even if you wear a suit. Richard smiled. Then I'll carry this with me, in every decision I make. And with that, the CO turned rookie walked away from the depot, not as a boss undercover, but as a man who'd finally remembered what made the engine run. Not spreadsheets or bonuses, but people. This journey reminds us that respect is earned on the road, not in a boardroom. If you were in Joe's shoes, would you gamble your job to defend a struggling stranger? Tell us below. And if this ride moved you, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories that keep the wheels turning. See you in the next video.